interrupt, especially if you have questions about anything that I'm talking about. And I'm going to talk about a project that we're just wrapping up the first stage of that takes place in this landscape, which is the landscape around Montreal. And so it looks something like this. It is, the area is called the Montérégie, and it is a really beautiful, mostly agricultural, but rapidly suburbanizing landscape that's, about a 45-minute or so drive from Montreal. The big hill there that you see at the top is called Mont Saint-Hilaire. It is a man in the biosphere reserve, so the communities are very familiar with issues having to do with biodiversity and biodiversity conservation, and they often invoke that in their decision making. But they came to us originally saying that they felt like a lot of their decision making about land use was very reactive, that someone would come in and say, I'd like to build a mall, can I build it here? And then they would say yes or no. Or I'd like to build this, can I do it over there? And they would say yes or no. And they were really looking for a way to be more proactive in a way that biodiversity wasn't really helping them, because their questions about biodiversity were things like, well, how many species can I afford to lose? And no scientist was willing to answer that question, because the answer none was a non-workable answer, and all was a non-workable answer, and everything in between we felt like we couldn't answer. So they were looking for something to help them be a little bit more proactive about land use decision making. So we came in saying, okay, how can we help you be more proactive and designing a resilient and multifunctional landscape? So one of the things that's, I guess not unique, but that's a real feature of this landscape is this mix of agriculture, suburbanization, people living in the area, a lot of recreation. There's just a lot going on, and people really felt strongly that it was important to retain that multifunctional nature of the landscape. And we came in saying, well, we'll do this through ecosystem services, and especially how the services are affected by the configuration of the landscape. So in our case, looking at forest patches, but where the forest is on the landscape and how connected the forest is. And that's driven by two things. So one is, this dark green is the Laurentian Mountains up here, and this dark green down here is the Appalachian Mountains. And there's a lot of talk in this region about how can we use forest restoration to connect those two pieces of heavily forested land in order to aid species to move, to adapt to climate change. And then Montreal itself is considering designing some sort of green belt around the city. So this gray is the island of Montreal, which is where the biggest city is. And the city is saying, well, we've got millions of dollars, we want to have a green belt, but we don't really know what that means, what kind of land use is going to be acceptable, or where to put all of this, this stuff. And then one of the other things that's happening is that the area around Montreal, sort of all the communities within, say, a 100-kilometer radius or so, have all agreed to preserve 17% of their land in green space of some sort. So that can include certain kinds of agriculture. And again, with that, they're trying to figure out where is that going to be, and what is that going to look like, and which piece of forest is most important. Is it this one over here or that one over there? So we really went first to the stakeholders to say, what's important to you? What kind of decisions are you making? And we spent about a year actually working with the stakeholders before we even wrote the grant proposal. So it was a little bit of an unusual approach to the science, simply because we wanted to do something that was useful to people. And what that allowed us to do in the end, though, was create a grant proposal that we had 13 mayors and 13 land use planners of the 13 towns in this particular county around Mont Saint-Hilaire were actually co-signatories on the grant proposal, saying, yes, we want this information, and we're going to work with these scientists to try to figure out how to do something that's useful. Okay, so in all of that conversation over that year, there were sort of three key issues that came up really strongly for us that we felt like we could help the community's approach. And that was, they didn't know how much land to conserve, so how much needed to be in forests in this landscape. They didn't know where, so they didn't know, for example, is this forest along the river really important, or is it that patch over there of nice big forest? So how much land to conserve in forest, where to conserve it, And then under what kinds of management? Could they just say, we're not going to convert this to agriculture and that's good enough, or do they need to be doing something in particular in that landscape? Okay, so that's kind of the setting from the user community side of what they were interested in, and we were of course interested in taking this ecosystem services approach and how could we use the ecosystem services approach to help expand the community's thinking beyond biodiversity and biodiversity-based management. And so we started going out to these communities and showing them pictures like this and saying, well, what services is this providing to you? You know, this is what your backyard looks like, you know, what's out there. So we, you know, get, well, food. This is a big field of soybeans, and so that's making food, or maybe it's making feed that we're going to feed to an animal, and that's going to make food. If I push a little more, they might say, well, I'm using that wood lot I use for wood to heat my house in the winter, and I tap the maple trees for maple syrup. Okay, this is good. Food, wood, maple syrup. What else is that landscape doing? Push a little bit. And then I get some things like, well, it's regulating climate because it's storing carbon in the forests, and those forests are also habitat for predators that eat soybean aphids that are a pest on the soybean fields, and there's some sort of water quality regulation that's going on as the water moves through the soil pores. And if I push more, I might get things like, well, aesthetic beauty, nature appreciation, deer hunting, all these activities that happen in the landscape. And so, you know, we were interested in all of those services and saying, well, could we find some way to map and measure all of those dozen services across the landscape? And so I'm going to show a few of these, so I'll just talk through what these look like. So I'm going to use these little flower diagrams, and you'll see the length of the petals on those flowers change. And so a longer or bigger petal for, say, crop production means that I have more crop production in that part of the landscape, and a smaller petal means that I have less of that. And so what we wanted to know, for example, was, do different parts of this landscape provide different mixes of service? So, you know, in the top part where I've got this cute little community, do I get a lot of forest recreation out of that landscape, and maybe a lot of carbon sequestration, but not very much crop production? So you see small petals for the crop production and big petals for the forest recreation, versus in the middle landscape where I might get a lot of soil phosphorus retention, a lot of crop production, a lot of soil organic matter, but probably not very much forest recreation. Or in the bottom landscape, maybe a lot of forest recreation and a lot of cottages and a lot of soil phosphorus retention, but not a lot of crop production. And one of the things we were interested in is, how fixed are those bundles of services? You know, if I go look at a landscape, do I know what kinds of services I'm going to get from that landscape? Or can I stretch bundles? And if I stretch, or petals, and if I stretch a petal, does it cause other petals to change or not? And so we talk about this in terms of whether the services are bundled or unbundled. So you could imagine in this top row, I've got some initial set of services that are being produced, and in a world where the services are unbundled, I can kind of stretch out this one petal this way, and nothing else really changes. Versus in a world where services are tightly bundled, I might stretch out that one petal, and then I get a bunch of synergies, which are other petals that also lengthen, or I might get trade-offs where some of those petals shrink. We don't really know, you know, are these services, are they bundled or are they not bundled? How much freedom do we have to go in and change things? And we started developing a typology of service interaction to think about those sorts of bundles. And so here we imagine that that services are either connected by the fact that they're affected by a shared driver. So for example, in number 2 on the bottom, crop yield and water quality are bundled together. But they're bundled together because they're both reacting to fertilizer use. So if I increase the fertilizer use in my field or in my watershed, I'm going to get more crop yield, and I'm going to get reduced water quality. And it's not really an interaction of the service. There's nothing about crop yield itself that is causing water quality to decline. It's just that they're both responding to fertilizer use. That's different than, say, in number 5 up at the top, where there's conservation tillage. That in and of itself has nothing to do with crop yield, but it increases my erosion control the fact that it increases the service of erosion control gives me benefits for crop yield. The benefits for crop yield in turn increase my erosion control. And there I've got a situation where the services themselves are interacting, not through a shared driver, but through themselves. And so what we started to think about was whether those services that are interacting directly maybe have a different kind of bundling than services that are interacting simply through a shared driver, where we might be more easily able to separate those out. So that's the theoretical background behind our interest in services, and you've got the community background behind what they're interested in. After that year of conversation, we came up with 3 driving questions that were sort of satisfying to us from a scientific perspective of being interesting work we could work on and satisfying to the communities, and they were these 3. So one is, how can this MRC, which is basically a county, how can this county manage the local landscape to maintain biodiversity and provide multiple services in the face of regional and global change? How would the development of a forest network of corridors linking natural areas affect current and future biodiversity and the provision of services? So here you hear that connecting the Laurentian and the Appalachian Mountains. And then how does the size and location of those corridors affect provision of biodiversity and services? And we developed from there a framework for this where we link land use and land cover, and especially the configuration or sort of the where of the forests on that landscape, to the biodiversity that's present in the landscape and the ecosystem services. So trying to link those 3, and what you'll see is that we did a lot of field work to understand the present. We used existing data to go back in the past. So we've so far gone back to the 1970s. We've now got most of our data ready to go back to the 1920s to look at not just how services have changed through time, but how the relationship between land use and services and biodiversity has changed through time. And then we take all of that information and go out and look at these scenarios of the future and try to help the communities understand, if they go this direction with their land use or that direction with their land use, what are the differences in the kinds of services that they're going to get. So what I want to do is walk through some bits and pieces. I won't show you everything about the project, but I'll walk through a couple of what I think are sort of representative or interesting aspects of the project. And I'll do that by just walking through different student pieces of the project. So the very first piece was just trying to develop a methodology to quantify the provision of services and their interactions across the landscape. And this was work done by Kira Raudsap-Hearn, who is the first PhD student on the project. So here's our flower diagram of those 12 services. And she assessed all of these services, so a mix of provisioning services, things like crop production and pork production, that's the stuff that we get off the landscape, with the cultural services, so this is things like recreation and deer hunting and summer cottages, with regulating services, so that's things like soil organic matter, or retention of phosphorus. All of this she did with existing data, things that were in government databases, places where the city could get us information on the tax revenue they were collecting from cottages. So this is not a going out in the field and measuring things kind of project. It's also not economic. So you'll notice that all of the measures are biophysical and not dollar values. We really weren't trying to get to any sort of economic valuation here. And there are very imperfect kinds of measurements. So for example, part of the way that we looked at water quality for this study was looking at how much cities are paying to clean the water that comes out of the streams in order to make it drinkable. You could argue about whether that's a great measure or not, but we wanted to do something that somebody else could pick up in another part of the world, have data available for, and do in their part of the world too. Okay, so this is the region. So just Montreal is sort of over here. Every area there is a county. So all of this data are just an average for each county. The darker colors are high provision of the service, and the lighter colors are low provision of a service. And the main thing to get from this is just every service has a unique distribution on the landscape. So you can see that, for example, there are a lot of crops kind of across the middle region. There's a lot of pork that happens just past the crops. There's a lot of maple syrup that happens just past further east of the pork, and a lot of forest recreation that happens further east of that. But every service has some sort of unique distribution on the landscape. We then went in county by county and looked at all the synergies and trade-offs that we found across the landscape for all of the services. And just two things to point out here. One is that crops and pork trade off with just about everything else. So in the areas where you have a lot of agriculture, we really don't get very many other services, which isn't that surprising. But what was pretty interesting to us was that where you get regulating services, you tend to have these synergies of multiple services. So you get these more multifunctional landscapes where you have deer hunting and forest recreation and soil organic matter and carbon sequestration and soil phosphorus retention all happening kind of on the same, in the same counties of the landscape. And then those bundles map back onto kind of known social ecological systems. So we then clustered those sets of services into 6 different kinds of bundles. So we have a bundle, for example, that we call the cottages bundle, which is all the way out into the east. That's where people from Montreal might have their cottages that they would go to on the weekend, and you could see that that landscape produces a lot of forest recreation. It stores a lot of phosphorus and carbon, does not have a lot of agriculture, has high water quality, so it has its own unique bundle. Versus, say, the bundle for cropland, which is number 1 there, that has a lot of crop production, a lot of soil organic matter and soil phosphorus retention, but not very much tourism or deer hunting or nature appreciation. So you get these different things, and they pretty much, to a Montrealer, they map out to where people say, oh yeah, you know, that tourism spot, that's where I go for a day on the weekend to visit the cute shops. Oh, that cottage, that's where my grandparents have a cottage. So it maps onto things that are socially familiar to people in that landscape. Okay, so it's the first real empirical identification of bundles where we found landscape scale trade-offs between the stuff on the landscape and almost all of the other kinds of services. We find that multifunctional landscapes are associated with high provision of regulating services, and that service bundles map onto these known social ecological subsystems. So there's something going on here with not just the biophysical or ecological part of the landscape, but that with the social part of the landscape contributing to the kinds of services that we get to. Yeah?
Could you just go a step back and explain again how you did the mapping between the social and the ecological? So it was, you looked at bundles where the distribution of those ecosystem services were similar, and then sort of abstracted social categories, or you had social categories and then you did averages of
Yeah, so the clusters are just, I don't remember what clustering algorithm, but some sort of like a k-means clustering. So the clusters are just independent data clusters that we then named, and then went back and asked people, you know, where do you expect this thing to be on the landscape? And just put them on the landscape based on which counties had services. So we're not actually looking really at social data other than to say this shows up where we think it should show up. Okay, so it's great, lots of interesting stuff, but why? What is it that happens? You know, why is it that we get services in this spot and not that spot? And especially for us, how does the configuration of the land use affect the provision of services through what mechanisms? Does it matter where things are on the landscape? And where that came from was really looking at the time, the existing models for ecosystem service provision. And so if in those models you took landscapes like this, they're all hypothetical landscapes with the same composition, so they all have the same amount of forest, in this case 50% forest, but in really different configurations. So, you know, half-half, or 2 big pieces of forest that are connected by a little link, or 4 separate patches of forest. In ecosystem service models at the time, they tended to treat those as pretty much the same in terms of the services that would be provided. So a little patch of pixel of forest that was surrounded by other pixels of forest was treated the same in these models as a pixel of forest surrounded by agriculture. And if you think for a minute about the way ecological systems work, you'll know that those pixels are pretty unlikely to actually provide the same amount of service in terms of carbon storage or habitat for deer or deer hunting. But nevertheless, that was the best we could do in terms of modeling them. So we wanted first to just start off by just confirming our hypothesis that configuration matters on the landscape. So this was work that was done by Kate Liss, who was a master's student in the lab, and she was looking at how elements of landscape structure interact to influence service provision. So she started by just quantifying the structure. So she looked at composition, so is the patch a forest or is it a suburb? And then 3 aspects of configuration. So the position, which is just where things are on the landscape, the connectivity, so how connected are the pieces of forest versus how separate, and then the shape. Do you get this really sinuous, octopus-like patch of forest, or is it a big blob with less arms sticking off of it? She then used structural equation modeling, which basically allows us to develop a hypothesis about the interaction and then test whether that hypothesis helps to explain our data or not. And so this was her hypothesis that basically that composition, so whether it's a forest or a suburb, makes a difference to the service that's provided. That these aspects of configuration that she measured would also make a difference to the service provided, and that composition itself would influence those configuration measures, right? So you can imagine if you have a little forest, it's harder for the forest patches to be connected than if you have a lot of forest. It's much easier to have those patches be connected. So that was her model. She had direct and indirect pathways, and then this is what we find coming off of that. So here showing in red, so all the services listed down the side. In red, the amount of the explainable variation that is explained by composition. In blue, the amount of the explainable variation that's explained by configuration. And in gray, the amount that's explained by both. And the key message really is that configuration or both play a pretty large role in telling us something about services. So models that are really just taking composition into account and aren't taking into account where things are in the landscape are probably wrong.
So you have sufficient data, for example, to look at water quality across a variety of landscape configurations? Because models don't really do that, or else they make phenomenal assumptions.
Yeah, so remember that all of this is happening at the county scale. So she's starting with Kira's county level data. So what we do is in each county, we measure the average of our landscape metrics. So what's the average values for composition and for position and shape of forests in particular across the county. And then we've got Kira's county level data for the services, and those are the 2 pieces that we're looking at. So we're probably missing a lot that's happening at smaller scales.
So you had water quality data at the county level?
So we have water quality data at the county level. This funny water quality, right? That's about how much cities are paying to clean the water, which is definitely funny. We're going back now and doing all of this through better data and remote sensing and getting 30-meter resolution data for all the services across the whole area. It's still going to be funny data because it's remotely sensed, and so there are things we do better and things we do worse. But I think that is going to adjust some of these values, because some of these, like cottage value, for sure configuration matters, but it doesn't seem right to me that it should matter as much as what her results are showing, because certainly people aren't building their cottages in the middle of suburbs. They're building their cottages out in the forest. So there's still something funny with the data, and I think it's mostly scale that's going on. Okay. Okay, so armed with that knowledge that where matters, we then set out to do this whole set of different field-based studies, really at a small scale, of walking through this land use and land cover, biodiversity, ecosystem function, ecosystem services, with basically an army of graduate students and undergrads out on the field trying to do this. And I'm going to walk through, I think, 3 of these different projects quite quickly. So one is work that was done by Matt Mitchell, who was a PhD student in the lab, with his conceptual model of walking from structural connectivity to functional connectivity to services and human well-being. Thank you. It doesn't help that I'm losing my voice. And he really wanted to know how structure and connectivity affected the provision of multiple services, and especially the role of biodiversity in mediating that effect, and doing this at quite a small scale. So looking at the distance away from forest patches in this landscape. And so this is his setup for his actual experiments. So he's got small forests and large forests, where the small patches are smaller than 10 hectares and the large patches are greater than 200 hectares, that are either connected, meaning that they're within 200 meters of another forest, or isolated, meaning that you have to go 1.5 kilometers away before you get to another forest patch. So he's got 4 types of forest that he's going to go to, and at every one of those patches of forest, he starts standing at the forest and walks into soybean fields that are adjacent to those forests and measures a bunch of different field measures and ecosystem service indicators. So first, within the first 100 meters, mostly measuring things that are happening below ground, so soil phosphorus retention, nitrogen, carbon, litter decomposition, microbial activity, and soybean yield that's happening above ground. And then within the first 500 meters, looking at things also above ground, so insect diversity, herbivory on the soybean plants, the abundance of insect herbivores and predators, soybean aphid abundance, they're a major pest in this region, and soybean yield. And I'll just walk through a couple of result pieces. So these are all looking at that distance from the forest across the x-axis, and then different measures of services on the y-axis, so soybean yield, aphid regulation, and insect herbivory regulation. And one thing that you can see right away is that the distance that he is away from those forests makes a difference, and that the forest itself makes a difference. So for those of you who know agriculture or have walked in agricultural fields, you know this dip in productivity, right? That's at the edge of the farmer's field, where they're turning around the plow, or the crops are competing with the forests for light or water. They get a dip in productivity. And one of the things that we found is they also get a little peak of productivity. And the area under the curve of that peak is actually greater than the loss that they get at the edge of field. And we think that what's going on there is that those forests are harboring predators that eat soybean aphids, and so they're getting a bump in production. So one of the things that we're able to do is go back out to the farmers and say, hey, that forest that you're using for wood to heat your house and for tapping for maple syrup, it's also providing you a benefit in probably giving you more soybean yield than you would get without that forest. Even though what you see is this decrease at the outside, you're getting this bump in the middle. So that was a sort of interesting immediate term effect. And then we're also able to look at the effect of structure on just the relationships between services. So in green showing synergies and red showing trade-offs. And what Matt found was that whether he was near or far, so close to the forest or farther away from the forest, affected the relationships that he sees between different services. So their actual interactions are changing across space. Okay. So I'll move on to work that was done by Carly Zeter, who was a master's student on the project. And she actually went to those same forests, so small and large, connected and unconnected, and also walked transects, but instead of walking transects out into the soybean fields, turned around and walked transects into the forest itself. And what she was interested in was this relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem services, and whether there was a win-win. Did more biodiverse forests produce more services, or whether there was a trade-off. So are there synergies or trade-offs in the relationship between carbon storage, which is the service that she chose to look at, and biodiversity across this particular landscape? So as she walked into these forests, she measured the species of trees, the diameter at breast height. She used allometric relationships to then calculate the amount of carbon that's stored as she moves along these transects. Just calculating above ground carbon, right? So down woody debris and standing trees. And then while she's out there, she also categorizes these forests by whether they're managed or not managed. And so managed here does not mean used for major timber forestry. It means, did someone have a sugar shack where they are tapping for maple syrup, and where they're cutting down trees for use to heat their house or not? And this is what she finds. So functional diversity on the x-axis and carbon storage on the y-axis. And let's look first at the red line, which is the unmanaged forests. So for unmanaged forests, there is a win-win. The more biodiverse that forest is, the more carbon that is being stored. Then we'll move on to the managed forest. In the managed forest, first thing to notice is the managed forests almost all store more carbon than the unmanaged forests until you get out to very, very high biodiversity in the forests. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is we get an opposite relationship. So in the managed forests, the more biodiverse they are, the less carbon they are storing. Now what we think is going on here is that management in this area means cutting down the trees that are not maple and keeping more maple trees. So the more biodiverse, or the less biodiverse forests have more maple trees. Maple is a very dense wood and it stores a lot of carbon. So the more these farmers are managing for maple, the more they're keeping these very dense, very high carbon storing trees around. The more biodiverse, they're losing those maples for other trees that maybe aren't storing as much carbon. It's kind of interesting though, because it's kind of in some ways it's like a win-win-win for carbon storage and management for maple syrup and timber and biodiversity. Okay. So I won't go much into the rest of the detail, except to say that we looked at bees and bee diversity because apple growing is a really big deal in this region. So we were interested in how the landscape configuration was affecting pollinator diversity and the kinds of services that we got from that. We looked at how configuration was affecting soil samples for nitrogen and phosphorus mostly, lots and lots of insects and leaves, etc. So there's a lot more there behind this that I won't go into, in part because I want to skip into some of the historical pieces. So this was work that was done by Delphine Renard, who is a postdoc in the lab, going back to the 1930s. Actually, it turns out it's much easier to go back to the 1920s because the war really cut down on the number of airplanes that were available to fly and take pictures. So most of our pictures are from the late 1920s out to 2013. And then ecosystem services, again, like Kira, collecting data at the county scale and mostly collecting data that's publicly available in some way. So it's in a government record of some kind, it's in the agricultural census, it's in the human census, it's in city data that they've collected about tourist attractions or people visiting those tourist attractions. And what I'll show is just data that goes back just to the 1970s, because we were able to collect a lot more ecosystem service information back to the 70s than we were before that. And so this is just a map of the region. So Montreal again, over on this side, going from the 1970s to 2006, and then the colors actually represent bundles, so not just individual services, but the bundle that's available. So bundle 1, B1 there, has a lot of chicken and a lot of pork, for example. Bundle 6 has a lot of carbon storage and a lot of hunting. Bundle 5 has a lot of recreation, bundle 7 a different kind of recreation, etc. And so there's maybe a couple things to notice. One is that we start off with a very mixed landscape, kind of every county producing a mixture of services. By the time we get to 2006, most counties have specialized in one service or another rather than trying to provide a mix. So the counties kind of specialize through time, and then where services are provided also moves around on the landscape through time as well as we get different population density pieces. And then a piece that I'm not showing here but that I think is pretty interesting is the trade-offs and synergies shift through time. So in the 1970s, for example, there's a trade-off between livestock production and hunting, which basically is the animals are outside in the fields and they're eating the same food that the deer would eat. So where you have cows outside in the fields, you don't have deer and you don't have deer hunting. By the time you move to 2006, all of those cows are now inside. They're not outside eating the food, they're getting fed corn that the farmer's buying from somewhere else. So the cows are no longer trading off with hunting. In fact, we get hunting overlapping largely with animal production, but now we have a trade-off between animal production and water quality because all of that manure is stored in really concentrated areas. So it's kind of interesting to us to see these relationships between land use and services, and the trade-offs between services is actually not just shifting across space, but shifting the internal mechanism of the synergy through time. Okay, so we take all of that information, and it's this poor guy's responsibility. This is Sylvestre Delmotte, who is also a postdoc on the project. And we said, okay, build us the Whatif machine. You know, what the counties wanted to know is, what does all of this mean for their land use decision making? Can you take all of this and build us some kind of model that will help the counties understand what the implications are of their land use decision making? No doubt a giant job for anybody. So Sylvestre went back out to our stakeholders, who we'd been meeting with every 4 months or so, all the way along the 3 or 4 years of the project, just talking to them about, you know, here's what we're finding, what kinds of decisions are you making? Goes back out to them and says, okay, let's develop some scenarios. So these are not meant to be, this is what we know is going to happen in the future, but rather these are some things that we hope are going to happen, or these are some things that we fear might happen in our future, that we want to understand what the ecosystem service implications are of those services. And so they were things like this one, which is called Too Much Is Not Enough, which was a scenario about building a road, a new road from Montreal into these communities that really drove a lot of development, and especially a lot of high-tech jobs, people who wanted to telecommute into Montreal. This was one that was driven by our Chamber of Commerce people on our advisory board, you know, really wanted to see what was going to happen if they brought a lot of people out to this landscape. What kinds of services would they provide? We also had one that was more driven, I think, by the ecologists in the room, of, you know, what happens if we really connect all of the forests and focus on hedgerows and build out the forest connectivity in the region without all of the development. We had 2 other ones that are, one is about energy and changes in energy prices, which we're now getting to watch happen in real time. It's kind of interesting. And then what Sylvestre does is developed models based on our data and other data that he was able to collect about what happens in each of these scenarios. So he picked a smaller area, just one county, to focus on for the models, and was able to model, for example, aesthetic quality with this is a view shed model. What does it look like today? And then under each of the different scenarios, what does it look like? So he produced maps of about 8 different services across 4 different scenarios. They're maps, right? And when we talk to the communities, we're very open about whether we're right or wrong in the details of where a particular service is going to be. But what we're able to do is bring these back out to the communities and at least start engaging them in a conversation about, well, what do you like and why? And where do you want this thing? What pieces of these scenarios would you like to bring about in real life, and what pieces do you want to avoid in real life? So for example, with our Chamber of Commerce scenario, in this scenario, we bring people out into the landscape. There's more and more people. They want to live in single family homes. Eventually they're moving out into the areas. You can see them moving up against the mountain there, which is Mont Saint-Hilaire. People start to realize their recreation service starts to decline, and they start to move away, and the Chamber of Commerce went, oops, that's not actually what we want to have happen. And so it affected, you know, if not the details of exactly where they want people to be, at least an understanding that there are implications of having a whole lot of people move to your region that maybe aren't the ones that you're thinking about in the 2 years down the road, but that are ones that happen in the 20 years down the road. And that was really true for all of these services. You know, even in the ecological one, there were things that happened that I went, oh, that wasn't quite what I was hoping to have happen, or what I was anticipating there. So it helped us, I think a little bit about the longer term in terms of planning for services in the region. There were lots and lots of people who worked on the project, some that I talked about, a lot that I didn't talk about, and lots of funders, and a ton of farmers who not only let us on their land, but actually often went out into the field with us and helped measure things, or were really interested. I mean, they let us spend 4 years on their farms. And then all of the